The garden was beautiful in the evening. The last golden rays of the sun put a golden hue over all the flowers. And that is where Robbie and Clara would sit. It had become a ritual. Every day after Robbie got off from work, he would go to the house of his fiancée. He would go onto the back veranda and they would sit and they would talk for hours about everything, of family and stories about growing up in different places, of holidays. And it wasn't unusual for Clara to ask him, "So what did you do at work today?" But she'd never asked this particular question of Robbie ever. She asked him what he had done after he'd left her home the night before. Well, he had done what he'd done pretty much every night during the summer. The heat was so oppressive in the South. And the one window in his boarding house room that he shared with a friend didn't knock any of the heat during the night. So after his roommate had gone to sleep and everyone else had settled down in the boarding house, he would creep down the stairs and out of the boarding house. He would hit the footpath and walk into the forest. He had found a deep pool in the river, and he loved to bathe in it and just let the cold water suck the heat from his body. Then he would go back to the boarding house and get a few hours of rest. But the night before, now that he remembered it, something different had happened. He was just about to plunge in for the last time when he'd heard a sound that he'd never heard before from the forest behind him. It was beautiful. It was a melody like no other. He wanted to find the source for this strange music, so he put on his clothes and he went in searching for it. But he couldn't find it. Then he thought maybe it was his friend from the boarding house playing a trick, so he went back to the boarding house. He went up to his room, but his friend was asleep in bed. And he almost forgot about it until she'd asked the question. He looked over at Clara, and she had gone deathly pale while he told this story. She begged and she pleaded with him not to go back down to the river. Whatever you do, don't go back down to the river. He didn't understand. No harm had been done. No one was hurt. Why was she so afraid? Then she told him this story. Years before, back before the town was even a village, a young maiden and a young man who was a sailor had fallen in love. They were soon to be married when the sailor was called away to war. After the war was finished, he was sailing back down the river on his boat when a fierce storm drove down the river. It capsized his boat, and he had drowned. The maiden was so overcome with grief that she went into a state of despair. A spirit of depression came on over her, and they say she died of a broken heart. But when she died, her spirit began roaming up and down the river. The townsfolk said that she took on the form of a maiden all dressed in white, that she sang a song that was a haunting melody that was irresistible to men, and it drew them to their deaths on the eve of their wedding. The townspeople called her the Yara. Bobby looked at Clara. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He laughed. He laughed. He laughed because he hadn't grown up in that small town. He hadn't heard the stories passed down from generation to generation from those who had lost loved ones to the Yara. He laughed because he didn't understand. Clara begged. She implored him not to go back down to the river, at least not until after they were married. After they were married, it would be fine. Robbie agreed, not because he believed the story. It sounded like a German fairy tale. But he agreed because he saw the heartache, the fear, the terror on Clara's face. And so to calm her, he acquiesced. Clara told him to wait where he was. She went up to her room. And a few minutes later, she came back down. She held in her hand a small crab shell, beautiful, round, and smooth, and she held it up to her lips, and she began to sing. The water is wide, I cannot get o'er, nor have I any wings to fly. Build me a boat that can carry two, and both shall row, my love and I. She closed her hand over the shell and she gave it to Robbie, and she told him to keep it in his pocket. And if he ever heard that monstrous voice singing to him, that he was to take that shell and hold it up to his ear, and he would hear her voice, maybe her voice would be stronger than the Yara's. Robbie took the shell, he put it in his pocket. At the end of the evening, Robbie walked down that path, and it was the most agonizing walk of his life. Trees lined the side of the path, and they reached out to him, almost begging him, imploring him to come. But Robbie remembered the promise that he had made to Clara. And he turned and he went home. But that melody, that sweet, drawing voice, it called to him every day. Every day it played through his mind, every day. And it got louder and louder. For 3 days, Robbie kept his promise. But on that 4th day, the pull was coming from deep inside of Robbie. He could not resist. Late in the night, he plunged into the forest, but this time he remembered the story that Clara had told, and he was a little more cautious. He was careful. He listened for anything, for any hint of a foreign voice or a strange being. But he saw nothing. The only thing he heard were the chirping of the crickets, the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. He took off his shirt and put it on the rock. He was just about to dive in for the first time when he looked at the reflection across the water. And he saw someone dressed in white reflected in the pool. Robbie leaped up. He grabbed his shirt. He ran until he cleared the edge of the forest. He turned around and looked back behind him. Robbie, my love. Robbie turned around and he ran. He did not stop until he reached his boarding house. He did not stop until he raced up the stairs, threw open the door, leapt into his bed, and pulled the covers up over his head. In the gray dawn, Robbie slipped out of the boarding house, back onto the path, back down to the river. He looked. He was trying to find any hint, any clue, any shred of evidence that there had been someone besides himself there the night before, but regardless of what he did, he could not find anything. What had happened the night before? went into work that morning. Something must have changed in his face because everyone seemed to be asking him if he was all right. They kept telling him that he looked a little pale. He said he was fine. But he knew deep down in his heart that he was already planning to go back to the river that night. He excused himself from his normal meal with Clara in the evening on the pretense of a monstrous headache. He went home. He rifled through the top drawer in his bureau. He removed a revolver. He loaded it. And just before midnight, he tucked it into his belt. He slipped down the stairs and out the door and onto the path. His feet began to walk. His heart pounded along with his pace, faster and faster and faster. He didn't stop until he reached the river. He withdrew his revolver and he looked around. Something crackled. A bird fluttered in the trees. But try as he might, there was nothing there. There was nothing there. Exhausted, Robbie leaned back against a tree and closed his eyes. Robbie's eyes snapped open. He was still holding the gun. How long had he been asleep? Fog had rolled in around and surrounded the ground around Robbie like a thick blanket. Robbie looked around. Then he saw it. A tiny tendril of fog danced up out of the river. It bowed, it swayed. And it coalesced into the form of a beautiful woman dressed all in white. Robbie, my love. My love. Robbie raised his gun. The shot echoed off the water. The report of the second shot, the third, the fourth, the fifth, until the gun was empty. The Yara stretched out her arms to Robbie, beckoning him, calling to him. Her song wrapped Robbie in a warm embrace. A numbness began to spread through Robbie's limbs. His eyelids grew heavy. The arm that held the gun slowly sank down to his side. His fingers let loose of the revolver, where it slipped into the water that now covered his ankles. Robbie's hand brushed against an odd lump in his trouser pocket. Strange. What could it be? With ever-slowing movements, Robbie pushed his hand into his pocket, his fingers wrapped around a cold, hard object. Slowly he withdrew his hand and uncurled his fingers. In his open palm lay a tiny shell. A spark of memory coursed its way through Robbie's brain. Clara. With all the strength he had left, Robbie lifted the shell to his ear. And a tiny voice trickled out. The water is white. As the song poured from the shell, it strengthened. Nor have I any wings to fly. Build me a boat that can carry two. The song burst out of the shell, sweeping away the fog and shredding the form of the Yara. And both shall roll, my love and I. As the last song strains filled the air, Robbie stood alone, the water lapping at his knees. The only sounds that could be heard were the gentle rushing of the river and the beat of his own heart.